Hello, welcome back to our channel, where we delve into the deepest and scariest secrets of the world. Today, we have content that will send shivers down the spines of even the bravest among us. Let's dive into true and supernatural stories, accounts of sinister shadows, malevolent presences, ghost stories, and paranormal encounters that defy any logical explanation. Prepare to hear stories that will stir your mind and heart. These episodes will make you question everything you think you know about life and death. Stories that will prompt you to reflect on the beyond. Watch and draw your own conclusions. Warning: these stories are real and have been reported. They may affect the minds of sensitive people and were sent by viewers. If you want to share a story, send it to us in the comments. Story 1. Matthew always felt comfortable in his small town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and where the routine seemed unchangeable. However, that night, something disturbing was about to alter that perception. Public transportation in the town was never very efficient, especially in the more remote areas, and Matthew, like many others, had opted for an electric bike for transportation. He enjoyed the freedom it gave him, being able to cross the deserted streets at night without depending on schedules or limited routes. It was a night like any other when, after finishing his activities at the sports center, he prepared to head home. The clock had just struck 11 p.m., and the sports center was nearly deserted. One of Matthew's colleagues, while closing the gate of the center, commented on the full moon, which seemed particularly bright that night. Another, more playful, shouted from afar, "Careful, Matthew. Nights like these are perfect for werewolves and witches." Everyone laughed, unaware of what was about to happen. Matthew started his electric bike, his mind still full of random thoughts and his body tired after a long day. Initially, everything seemed normal. The streets were quiet, as usual. But there was something different about that night. The town, which normally had constant movement, was eerily deserted. Matthew tried not to mind it, attributing the absence of people to the late hour. As he pedaled through the silent streets, Matthew approached a road he always avoided, but which was an important shortcut that reduced his journey by nearly half an hour. This road was infamous in town, surrounded by tall, dense trees that blocked the sparse light from the street lamps. The pavement, which started as asphalt, soon turned into uneven cobblestones, before giving way to a dirt path. It was a gloomy place, where the wind always seemed to blow colder and where footsteps echoed disturbingly. What made this road even more sinister was the old convent that lay halfway down. The convent of the Seventh-day Congregation, as it was known, had a history marked by a tragedy that few dared to mention. It was said that decades ago, a terrible tragedy occurred there. The nuns, who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, were victims of a devastating fire. The fire spread rapidly during the night, catching everyone off guard. Many of them could not escape in time, and their screams echoed through the darkness, mixing with the crackling of the flames. The survivors, traumatized, left the convent, which was never fully rebuilt. The few who remained were the most devout, those who believed their prayers could purify the place from the horrors they witnessed. Over the years, the convent gradually fell into ruins, becoming a place avoided by everyone. Some residents claimed to hear whispers at night, as if the souls of the nuns still wandered there, trapped between this world and the next. Others swore they had seen dark figures in the corridors and broken windows. It was a place of mourning and suffering, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the weight of the past. That night, as Matthew approached the convent, a strange sense of unease took hold of him. The wind began to blow stronger, and heavy clouds quickly covered the full moon, plunging the street into oppressive darkness. He tried to turn on the bike's flashlight, but, inexplicably, it wouldn't work. It was as if the surrounding darkness sucked all the light away, leaving him alone in the gloom. Despite his unease, Matthew continued pedaling slowly down the deserted street. As he neared the convent, the air seemed to grow heavier, laden with a dark energy that made him shiver. He could see the large wooden gate of the convent, closed as always. But that night there was something different, something that made him hesitate. The gate, which he had passed so many times, seemed to be watching him, as if it had a life of its own. Suddenly, Matthew felt a penetrating gaze on his back. He turned abruptly and saw, to his horror, that the gate, previously closed, was now slightly open. His heart raced, and he nearly lost control of the bike. There was no way someone could have opened the gate silently. It made no sense. He braked the bike sharply, trying to regain his balance and understand what was happening. Trying to push away the growing sense of dread, Matthew crossed to the other side of the street, hoping to feel safer. But it was to no avail. The feeling of being watched only worsened. It was as if dozens of eyes were fixed on him, following every move. He felt he was not alone, that something or someone was lurking in the darkness. With his heart pounding uncontrollably, Matthew looked towards the side of the convent and saw a black shadow. It was as tall as a person, but without a face or defined form, just a blot of darkness that seemed to absorb all the light around it. He tried to speed up the bike, but his muscles were stiff with fear. When he looked again, the shadow had multiplied. There were several of them, all advancing slowly towards him. Terror completely overtook him. Matthew screamed, a sound that echoed down the deserted street, but it seemed to be muffled by the presence of the shadows. He pedaled with all his might, trying to escape the figures that now moved faster, as if they wanted to grab him and drag him into the depths of the darkness. The path that once seemed short now felt endless. Every meter felt like an eternity as the shadows drew closer. Finally, Matthew spotted the light at the end of the street. With one last burst of energy, he pushed the electric bike to its limit, crossing the boundary between darkness and light. When he finally felt safe under the streetlight of the main road, he turned to look back. There was nothing there. The shadows had disappeared as mysteriously as they had appeared. There was no sign of any presence, just the wind blowing gently among the trees. Matthew didn't stop until he reached home. When he finally entered, his mother, a devout woman, immediately noticed something was wrong. He was pale and shaking. Unable to hold back the tears, Matthew recounted what had happened, reliving each moment of terror in his mind. His mother, visibly disturbed, prepared a spiritual cleansing for him. She lit a candle, said prayers, and used eggs, following an ancient family tradition. They placed the eggs under Matthew's bed, and she stayed by his side until he could fall asleep. Despite the terror he had experienced, Matthew had a peaceful night, as if the ritual had driven away any evil that was pursuing him. The next morning, when they removed the eggs from under the bed, they saw something disturbing. The egg white was dark, almost black, and the yolk completely cooked, as if it had been boiled overnight. Concerned, they called a family friend, a man experienced in spiritual matters, to try to understand what had happened. The friend listened to Matthew's story attentively and, after reflecting, mentioned that it could be the work of shadow entities, obsessive spirits that feed on fear and spiritual weakness. He warned Matthew to avoid that street and, whenever possible, say prayers before leaving home, asking for protection. Since that night, Matthew avoids passing through that street, but when he has no choice, he says a silent prayer, asking that the shadows never pursue him again. He still hasn't found answers to what happened that night. The questions remain: what were those shadows? Why did they follow him? And how could they be so close to a holy place like the convent of the Seventh-day Congregation? The mystery remains, and Matthew knows that, on some nights, the darkness hides secrets that perhaps should never be revealed. Story 2. 4 German friends, Lucas, Hannah, Felix and Anna, were in search of adventure and new experiences. They had heard about a small town in the United States, nestled in the mountains, known for its challenging trails and breathtaking views. With a spirit of exploration, they decided this would be their next great adventure. Upon arriving in the town, they were charmed by its tranquility. It was a typical small American town, with old houses, deserted streets, and residents who seemed like they stepped out of an 80s movie. However, there was something in the air that made them slightly uncomfortable, an inexplicable feeling that time here flowed differently, slower, as if the town was trapped in some kind of temporal bubble. They left their belongings at a small inn and, after talking with the owner, decided to explore one of the region's most famous trails. The old man warned them with a concerned look, "Be careful in the mountains," he said with a raspy voice. "There are things up there you don't understand. Things that shouldn't be disturbed." The young friends laughed, thinking it was just an attempt to scare them, a horror story for tourists. The next day, with backpacks ready and contagious enthusiasm, the four ventured onto the trails. The path was initially well-marked and easy to follow. The towering trees, the fresh mountain air, and the sound of birds created a revitalizing atmosphere. Everything seemed perfect, until they started noticing something strange. The trail began to narrow, and the environment grew denser. Lucas was the first to notice old, dirty, and broken bottles hanging from the trees, swinging gently in the wind. Further along, Hannah saw a doll hanging by a thread, missing an arm, with empty eyes and its head tilted to one side, as if it was watching them. Felix found another doll, this one with its entire body, but its face had been painted black, marked with deep scratches. Anna, the most curious of the group, commented, "Must be some local tradition, maybe a weird ritual." Trying to ignore the growing discomfort, they decided to continue. As they advanced, the forest seemed darker. The sunlight, which had previously illuminated the path, now barely penetrated the treetops, creating long and distorted shadows. The trail, which had been clear, was now almost invisible, covered by dry leaves and fallen branches. The air was heavy, and the sounds of the forest, which were once comforting, became menacing. Danger seemed to emerge from all sides, crackling murmurs, and whispers that made their skin crawl. It was then that they began to feel they were being watched. Each step on the trail seemed accompanied by something that moved silently among the trees. Felix, always the skeptic, suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" Everyone turned to him, but before anyone could answer, a louder noise, like breaking branches, came from behind them. The group turned around at the same time, but there was nothing there. Only silence and the darkness of the forest. They continued, now with racing hearts and eyes alert for any movement. The feeling of being followed only intensified. With each minute, the tension became almost unbearable. That's when they found a cave hidden among the trees. Exhausted and with night approaching, they decided it would be the ideal place to spend the night. They lit a fire at the cave's entrance and settled inside, trying to ignore the increasing sense of danger. As the fire crackled, illuminating the stone walls around, Hannah noticed something peculiar on the cave walls. Approaching, she saw they were covered with strange symbols, carved forcefully as if someone had used a sharp object to mark them. Some of the symbols were just scribbles, but others were clearly human shapes, distorted, with large eyes and mouths open in silent screams. Anna, who was exploring deeper into the cave, called the others with a trembling voice, "You need to see this." They gathered around her and with the light of the fire, saw what she had found. Dark stains on the walls, as if someone had spread fresh blood all over. There were handprints, scratches, and the metallic smell hung in the air, mixed with the dampness of the cave. Fear began to take over the group. "I think we should get out of here," said Lucas, trying to stay calm. But before they could do anything, they heard a deep reverberating sound coming from deep within the cave, like a heavy, deep breath from something that was waking up. The flames of the fire flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to move strangely, as if coming to life. They were paralyzed with terror, unsure what to do. Then the breathing became louder, closer, and Felix shouted, "Run!" All of them stood up at the same time, leaving behind their backpacks and everything they had. They ran out of the cave, but the path was now covered in thick fog, making it hard to see. The shadows seemed to chase them, moving quickly around them, whispering incomprehensible words. The group ran through the forest, directionless, just trying to escape. The ground seemed to want to swallow them, with roots entangling their feet, branches cutting their skin, and the feeling that they were running in circles. The sounds of footsteps behind them increased, fast and decisive, as if something was approaching, feeding on their fear. Suddenly, Hannah stumbled and fell, twisting her ankle. Lucas, who was ahead, turned back to help her, but as he approached, he realized something was wrong. Hannah was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on something behind him. "Don't look," she whispered with a broken voice. But it was too late. Lucas turned and saw, for a brief second, the slender dark figure with shining eyes staring at him. He froze, unable to move, feeling terror take over his body. Anna and Felix, who were ahead, stopped and came back to help. Felix pulled Lucas by the arm while Anna helped Hannah stand. The four continued to run, but their strength was fading. The fog became thicker, and the trees around seemed to close in, suffocating them. They knew they couldn't keep going for much longer. Finally, the lights of a road appeared ahead, through the fog. It was a narrow and deserted road, but it meant safety, an escape from the darkness of the forest. With their last strength, they ran towards the road, but as they arrived, they heard a loud and deafening sound, like a scream of pain and anger, coming from the forest. Something didn't want them to leave. As they reached the road, they collapsed on the asphalt, gasping and in panic. Fortunately, a car was passing by, and the driver, a middle-aged man, stopped upon seeing the state of the young people. He helped them into the car and, without asking questions, drove them to the town's police station. At the station, the young people told their story to the police, but it was obvious they didn't believe them. Their backpacks were found in the cave, but there were no signs of blood or the marks they had seen. The police just said they were probably imagining things, due to exhaustion and fear. The group left the town the next day, but the experience deeply marked them. They knew what happened in that forest was real, that something had followed them, something that couldn't be explained. Even back in Germany, the nightmares continued. They saw themselves back in that cave, running but never able to escape. And the feeling of being watched never left them. The small town continued its quiet life, and the trails were forgotten by tourists. But the residents knew, whispers were exchanged in shops and bars, that the forest held ancient secrets, and that the young people were lucky to have escaped with their lives. Many who ventured into those mountains weren't so fortunate. And as long as the forest remains silent, the mystery of who, or what, pursues the unwary who dare to enter its domain will continue to be a well-guarded secret, buried in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Story 3. After finishing college, John decided he needed a break before diving into the job hunt. To clear his mind, he opted for a solo backpacking trip through the forests of northern Michigan. Raised in the suburbs, he wasn't exactly a wilderness survival expert, but he had some experience from childhood camping trips and believed he could handle a few days hiking in the Hiawatha National Forest. Looking back, he realized how naive and unprepared he really was. John was equipped with a decent backpack, a lightweight tent, and a quality sleeping bag, but he had never undertaken a serious hike in such remote areas before. He planned a route that would take him on a large loop through the most isolated parts of the forest, imagining he could cover about 10 miles a day. This turned out to be an overly ambitious expectation for his level. The first few days were incredible. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and pleasant temperatures. John enjoyed the solitude. There was something magical about being completely alone in nature, surrounded only by trees and the sound of birds. He occasionally stopped to filter water from streams or take photos of stunning scenery. At night, he set up camp, ate dehydrated meals, and fell asleep to the soft sound of leaves in the wind. It was on the third night that things began to get strange. He had hiked more than usual, trying to reach a small lake he had marked on the map as a good camping spot. By the time he arrived, the sun was already setting behind the trees. John quickly set up his tent and started a small fire, wanting to settle in before darkness took over the area. As he sat by the fire, heating a bowl of soup, he felt a sudden and intense sensation of being watched. It was that prickle on the back of his neck, but much more intense. John looked around, scanning the trees at the edge of the small clearing where he had set up camp, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted, as if something was hidden in the shadows, watching his every move. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. After all, being alone in the forest can play tricks on the mind. But as the night progressed, the feeling of being watched only intensified. Every now and then, he saw quick movements out of the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing. The sounds of the forest also changed. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs disappeared, leaving a disturbing silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch in the darkness. John barely slept that night. Every time he began to doze off, he awoke startled, convinced he heard footsteps or breathing outside his tent. When the sun finally rose, he was exhausted and on high alert. Part of him wanted to pack up and run back home, but he insisted to himself that he was just being paranoid. He had come here seeking adventure, after all. However, something seemed off about the forest that day. The trees appeared denser, the shadows deeper. John checked his maps and compass repeatedly, but he didn't seem to be making progress. The landmarks he was looking for just didn't appear. It was as if the landscape was subtly changing around him, distorting his perception. By late afternoon, he had to admit he was lost. None of the terrain matched his map. He thought about trying to backtrack, but he wasn't sure which direction to go. The sun was hidden behind a dense canopy of trees, and his compass began to spin uncontrollably, its needle twirling aimlessly. That's when he stumbled into a clearing. And there, standing on the edge of the clearing, he saw for the first time something that made him freeze in terror. It was an impossibly tall figure, over 6 feet, thin as a shadow but three-dimensional. It had no distinct features, just a vague humanoid shape, something that hurt the eyes to try and focus on. John felt an icy chill run through his body, as if all his organs had sunk inside him. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just remained there, watching him. John didn't know how, but he felt its gaze piercing his soul, even without being able to see its eyes. After what seemed like an eternity, he slowly backed away, never taking his eyes off the figure. As soon as he reached the tree line, he turned and ran like he had never run before. He ran until his lungs burned, branches tearing at his skin and clothes. When he finally collapsed on the forest floor, gasping and covered in cold sweat, he realized night was falling again. He knew he needed to get up, find water, and set up camp, but he was paralyzed by fear and exhaustion. Then, he heard it. It was a sound like a rattle, a high-pitched noise that seemed to come from all directions at once. Beneath that sound, there was something deeper, a dull noise, like footsteps approaching. John jumped up, fear forcing him to keep running, even without knowing where. He didn't know how long he ran, but at some point, he realized the rattling sound had stopped. The forest was once again deadly silent. Slowing down, he began to see something different. There were lights around him, snaking between the trees, small yellow flames that seemed to dance in the air. Despite all his instincts screaming to run in the opposite direction, he felt drawn to them. As he got closer, he realized the lights began to circle around him, forming a path that led him through the forest. John followed the lights, unthinkingly, driven by an inexplicable impulse. The lights guided him to a clearing where the trees had strange symbols carved into the bark. One of the symbols he managed to recognize was that of a snake biting its own tail. When he reached out to touch the symbol, the world around him seemed to distort, or perhaps he simply fainted. The next thing he remembers is opening his eyes and realizing the lights had disappeared. He was lying in a different clearing, where everything seemed unnaturally calm. His surroundings had changed. In the distance, he saw lights. But this time they were man-made. They were lights from a small town that he was sure hadn't been there before. John hurried towards the lights, finding the nearest road. People looked at him strangely as he passed, and he only then realized his appearance. He was filthy, bruised, with wild eyes. He found a convenience store and walked in, going straight to the counter. With a hoarse voice, he asked, "Excuse me, can you tell me where I am?" The clerk gave him the name of a town he had never heard of, in a state hundreds of miles from where he had started his hike. Stunned, John asked what day it was. When the clerk responded, his legs buckled. Somehow, impossibly, more than 2 weeks had passed since he entered the forest. 2 weeks of which he had no memory. One night, I woke up with an overwhelming sensation of being watched. It was dark, but I felt a presence near my bed. The door was closed, but I swore I saw Michael's figure, standing next to the bed, looking at me with those cold, lifeless eyes. My breath quickened, fear took over me. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just a nightmare, but when I opened them again, he was no longer there. The noises in the house during the night became more frequent. Crackling, whispers, footsteps. I began to hear voices, distant, almost inaudible, but always there. Whatever it was driving me to the brink of madness. One night, I heard the sound of something heavy dragging down the hallway. When I looked through the door crack, I saw something I will never forget. Michael, in his wheelchair, was moving alone down the hallway, the wheels turning without him pushing them. He seemed unconcerned with my presence. He just continued, towards the staircase. I tried to call him, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I followed him to the stairs, where he stopped, slowly turning his head towards me, as if he knew I was there. His black eyes, now void of any humanity, fixed on mine. And then he fell, the wheelchair rolling down the stairs, a terrible sound of metal clashing and bones breaking. I ran to him, expecting the worst, but when I got there, the wheelchair was empty. Michael had disappeared. Panic took over me. I screamed for help, but no one responded. The house was plunged into a deadly silence, as if it had been abandoned. I ran through the corridors, trying to find the employees or Michael's parents, but the house seemed like a labyrinth, doors closing behind me, corridors stretching endlessly. Finally, I found Michael's parents in the living room, but what I saw there froze my blood. They were sitting, holding hands, with wide eyes and mouths open in a silent scream. They were dead, their lifeless bodies, but their eyes. They were filled with terror, as if they had seen something beyond human comprehension. Desperate, I ran out of the house, but as soon as I reached the garden, I heard Michael's voice. He was calling me, a sweet and innocent voice. I turned around, and there he was, standing in the middle of the garden. "Greta, why are you running? Don't leave. Stay with me." His words were soft, but laden with insidious evil. I couldn't move, trapped by that cold gaze, until something inside me broke the spell. I screamed and ran, not looking back, feeling his presence chasing me to the gates of the property. Finally, the police were called. When they arrived, I told them everything, but of course, they didn't believe me. They found the bodies of Michael's parents, but no sign of the boy. The house was sealed off, and the employees were questioned, but nothing substantial was discovered. I was released, but I left that place knowing I would never be the same. What happened in that house has never been explained. Some say it was just a tragedy, others whisper about curses and vengeful spirits. I, however, know what I saw. And to this day, when I close my eyes, I still see Michael's face, the true Michael, the one who should never have been released. Story 5. Sasha was an experienced bus driver. For 15 years, he traveled the roads between small towns across the United States, transporting passengers with a calmness only experience could provide. He knew every curve, every pothole, every peculiarity of the roads that cut through those isolated places. For him, driving was more than a job, it was a comforting routine. However, that night, something felt different from the start. The bus was full when he departed from the origin town, which was not uncommon. Throughout the trip, he dropped people off at their destinations, and the vehicle gradually emptied. The night was eerily silent, and Sasha noticed that the road seemed more deserted than usual, which was unusual even for such a rural area. As the bus moved forward, a thick fog began to form, covering the road with an almost supernatural layer of mist. The bus lights barely penetrated the fog, and Sasha felt an increasing sense of discomfort. The monotonous sound of the engine seemed to be the only thing keeping the environment anchored in reality. When only 6 passengers remained on the bus, Sasha heard a sharp crack and then felt the bus tilt slightly to the right. He stopped the vehicle and got out to inspect. A tire was flat. It was an inconvenient situation, but nothing he hadn't dealt with before. However, while changing the tire, the fog around him seemed to close in, making everything around him indistinct and distorted. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of something he couldn't identify. After changing the tire, Sasha got back on the bus and noticed something strange. A group of people was standing by the roadside, asking for a ride. It was unusual for him to stop for strangers, especially on such a deserted road and on such a foggy night, but the group looked desperate. There was an elderly couple, a young woman with a small suitcase, and a man with a hat pulled down low, his face barely visible. For a moment, Sasha almost gave in to the temptation to stop, but an instinctive feeling that something was wrong made him drive on. The road continued, and the fog only got denser, making each kilometer longer and more exhausting. The passengers, now reduced to just 6, were restless, sitting in silence as if they too felt the strangeness of the situation. Sasha frequently checked the rearview mirrors, an uneasy feeling making him check if everything was normal. After a few kilometers, he saw something that made him stop. A car was across the road, its lights flashing weakly, and next to it were a woman and a small child. The woman looked exhausted, and the child was huddled next to her, clutching an old doll. Sasha couldn't just leave them there, not on that deserted road, in the middle of dense fog. He stopped the bus and got out to offer help. The woman accepted the ride with a silent nod, but something about her expression, or the lack of it, made Sasha's hair stand on end. She didn't smile, didn't thank him, just boarded the bus with the child by her side, sitting in the back, away from the other passengers. The child, listless, clutched the doll tightly, but there seemed to be no life in her eyes. Sasha watched their reflection in the rearview mirror before returning to the wheel, but something about the reflection seemed off, as if the image of the child wasn't completely synchronized with reality. He shook his head, trying to dispel the strange feeling. But as he continued to drive, more disturbing things began to happen. The bus lights flickered sporadically, and the radio, which he always kept tuned to a country music station to keep the ride enjoyable, began to emit static and distorted voices that he couldn't understand. Sasha felt a chill down his spine when, looking through the rearview mirror, he saw something that froze him for a second. The reflected image showed a dark figure with glowing red eyes, sitting next to the woman and the child. It looked like a demon, staring intently at him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again, but the figure had disappeared. Only the woman and the child were there, motionless, staring ahead as if nothing had happened. The other passengers also started to become restless. A man in the front asked Sasha how much longer it would be until they reached the next town, but Sasha didn't have a certain answer. The road seemed endless, and the fog only worsened. The bus's GPS, which should have guided him, was strangely disoriented, spinning endlessly, unable to locate the correct position. Suddenly, a burst of light cut through the fog, followed by a loud noise like metal tearing. The bus swayed violently, causing the passengers to scream in fear. Sasha struggled to keep control of the vehicle and managed to stop before anything worse happened. When he looked back, he saw that the passengers were unharmed, but terror was etched on their faces. The woman and the child, however, remained eerily calm, as if they were oblivious to the chaos around them. Sasha felt something cold pass through his body, a sense that something was terribly wrong. He decided he needed to get everyone off the bus, even if it meant continuing on foot, but before he could act, the bus engine died, plunging everyone into total darkness. For a moment, everything was completely silent. And then, the whispers started. Low, unsettling sounds that seemed to come from all directions. Sasha tried to start the bus again, but the engine wouldn't respond. The whispers grew louder, sounding like children's voices, mixed with laughter that didn't seem human. Sasha looked back at the passengers and saw that they were all in a state of silent panic, except for the woman and the child. They remained motionless, but something in their eyes had changed. The child was now standing in the aisle, the doll dropped on the floor, and Sasha saw the impossible. The child was floating, her feet not touching the ground, and a malevolent smile spread across her pale face. In a swift and terrifying motion, the child turned her head to face Sasha. Her eyes, previously empty, were now deep black, without pupils, reflecting only the abyss. The woman slowly rose and began walking towards him, but her movements were unnatural, as if her bones were being controlled by invisible strings. Sasha tried to stand and run, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. The voices in the bus grew louder, now a distorted chorus of laughter and screams. He felt an overwhelming pressure on his chest, as if something was trying to pull him into the darkness. And then, as if time had stopped, the bus door opened by itself. The fog outside seemed to come alive, entering the vehicle and enveloping all the passengers. Sasha felt he was losing consciousness, the air becoming thick, hard to breathe. The last thing he saw before passing out was the woman and the child smiling at him, their faces deformed, transforming into something monstrous. When Sasha awoke, the sun was rising, and the bus was parked on a deserted road, with no sign of the fog or the passengers. The engine was running, the dashboard indicated that he was a few kilometers from a small town, but something was terribly wrong. He looked around and saw that the bus was empty, completely empty. He stepped out of the vehicle, taking deep breaths of the fresh morning air, trying to shake off the nightmare sensation. But when he looked at the ground, next to the bus, he saw the doll the child had been holding, thrown in the dirt. A chill ran through his body. He picked up the doll with trembling hands and observed it. It was stained with blood, and its glass eyes seemed to stare directly at him, with a look that chilled his heart. Sasha dropped the doll and returned to the bus, determined to leave that place as quickly as possible. But as he boarded the vehicle, he heard a low, almost inaudible sound coming from the back seat. A whisper that said his name. He turned slowly and saw in the last seat a familiar figure. The woman was sitting there, with a child by her side, their eyes black and empty. They stared at him, as if they were waiting for him. Sasha was never seen again. The bus was found empty, parked by the side of the road, with the door open and the keys in the ignition. The police investigated, but found no clues about what had happened. What remained were reports from drivers who occasionally see an old bus traveling the deserted roads of the region, with a woman and a child sitting in the back, looking out with eyes that do not belong to this world. And those who try to approach disappear into the fog, leaving no trace. Story 6. I am an ambitious young man, freshly armed with a degree in business administration and the whole world ahead of me. My name is Ethan, and everything seemed to be going well. I had secured a job at a fairly good company, nothing spectacular but a solid start. From the beginning, I stood out. I was always hardworking, knew how to behave, and quickly made friends with several people at the company. My sociable and efficient demeanor caught the attention of the shareholders, and even the deputy manager took notice of me. It seemed like a bright future lay ahead. Everything started on a Friday evening. Some colleagues and I decided to go out after work to celebrate the end of another week. Amidst laughter and conversation, fueled by plenty of alcohol, a strange topic came up. One of the guys, slightly drunk, began talking about a secret cult that some of the company's powerful were part of. I laughed it off, thinking it was just one of those urban legends that come up after a few drinks, but he was serious. Before we parted ways, he warned me not to drink too much, because the next day would promise a lot. I took it as a joke, something to scare the newbie, and went home, exhausted and with a buzzing head. The next morning, as I woke up, there was a knock at the door. I went to answer it and found a delivery person holding a package. I signed for it and brought the package to the kitchen, where I placed it on the table. Still groggy, I laid back down but couldn't fall asleep again. Something about that delivery was unsettling. I got up, went to the table, and decided to open the package. Inside was another, smaller box, made of dark wood, ornately decorated. Next to it was an envelope. Curious, I opened the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper containing a contract. As I began to read, my blood ran cold. It was an invitation to join a secret society dedicated to Satanism. The contract promised that my life would radically turn for the better if I accepted. Everything I ever wanted, success, money, power, would be within reach. There was a disturbing instruction at the end: if you agree, sign with your blood. My heart raced. The thought of participating in something like this was utterly absurd, but at the same time, I couldn't resist the temptation. I was young, ambitious, and curiosity had always been my weakness. After a few minutes of hesitation, I did something I never thought I would do. I took the small blade from the box, made a slight cut on my finger, and signed the contract with my own blood. As soon as I was done, a shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know if it was fear, excitement, or pure adrenaline, but the fact was, I had done it. I placed the box in the hallway of my apartment, unsure of what to do next. Less than 2 minutes later, I checked, and the box was gone. There was no trace that anyone had been there. Everything felt surreal. That evening, as promised in the contract, a car came to pick me up. I was blindfolded and taken to an unknown location. When the car stopped, the blindfold was removed, and I saw that I was in front of a huge mansion, surrounded by an atmosphere of mystery and oppression. I was led through long corridors into a large hall where dozens of people, all dressed in black robes, were waiting for me. One of these robes was handed to me, along with a mask, and I was instructed to put them on. With the robe and mask, I became another anonymous face among the many present. The rituals began: animal sacrifices, dark invocations, and the growing sense that I had gotten into something much bigger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I felt out of place, uncomfortable, but it was too late to go back. Before I knew it, I was part of the ritual, participating in something I could never have imagined. Even with a queasy feeling in my stomach, I continued, trying to convince myself that all this had a purpose. In the following days, I noticed changes. My position at the company improved rapidly. I was promoted, invited to important meetings, and some of the people who had barely noticed me before now treated me almost with reverence. But something was not right. Some friends began to distance themselves without apparent reason, while others approached me in a disturbing manner, as if they knew something I did not. Professional success came, but the price I paid was high. The cult was not something I could just ignore. The rituals became more frequent, more intense. Each meeting demanded new sacrifices, new offerings. It was no longer just about animal blood, but about carnal rituals involving men and women, always masked, always unknown. I was caught in a cycle of lust, violence, and fear, and increasingly I felt like I was losing my soul. A year passed, and what was once exciting became a constant nightmare. I was alone. My true friends had disappeared, replaced by false faces and empty smiles. I tried to convince myself that I was in control, but the truth was, I was just a pawn in a game I didn't understand. The rituals disturbed me more and more. The visions I had during the meetings invaded my dreams, and soon I couldn't distinguish between reality and imagination. I decided I wanted out. But I didn't know how. They knew. They knew everything. Every thought, every desire. It was as if they were in my head. I tried to flee, to quit my job, to disappear, but they always found me. One day, I drove out of the city, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the life I had built, when an accident happened. The car just veered off the road, as if an invisible force had grabbed the steering wheel. I survived, but I knew it was no ordinary accident. Now I live in constant fear. I feel that I am being followed. I look over my shoulder with every step, and every time I close my eyes, I see masked faces, hear the chants, smell the blood. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. The success I have achieved seems insignificant compared to the price I am paying. This is my story. A story that began with ambition and curiosity and has now turned into a nightmare from which I cannot wake up. If you are reading this, be aware that I am not safe. I will never be safe again. And if anyone ever offers you a contract promising everything you ever wanted, remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The life I once knew is forever lost. What was once a promising start has turned into an incessant nightmare that haunts me both awake and asleep. Every time I try to return to normalcy, I am painfully reminded that I will never be the same person again. The days are hard to endure, but the nights are even worse. As soon as darkness falls, I feel the presence of those who pursue me. They are always there, invisible, but I feel their eyes on me, hear their whispering voices lurking in the shadows. They never let me forget what I have done, and they constantly remind me that there is no escape. I have tried to reclaim my life. I changed jobs, moved to a different city, even tried to make new friends. But it doesn't work. Every time I think I might make a fresh start, They reappear, in my thoughts, in my dreams, sometimes even in my surroundings. There is no escape, no safe place. The memories of the rituals haunt me. The masked faces, the dark incantations, the bloody sacrifices, all are deeply etched into my consciousness. I see their grimaces, hear their chants, and feel the cold blood on my hands. There is no redemption, no forgetting. They have taken a part of me, and that part will haunt me forever. I have tried everything to rid myself of this curse. I have sought out priests, spiritual cleansers, even exorcists. But nothing has helped. They all tell me that I have summoned something monstrous, something that will not simply disappear. Their words sound like the death sentence of my soul. Now, I write this as a warning. Not for me. For me it is probably too late. But for anyone as ambitious and naive as I was. Do not be lured by false promises. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And the darkness that breaks through them can devour everything you hold dear. If you read this, remember that nothing promised in a moment of glory is worth losing your soul for. The shadows that pursue me may also find you, and when that happens, you will understand what it means to live in constant fear. This is not just a story. It is my reality, and it could be yours too. If you ever feel tempted, think of me, the young man who had everything and lost it all. There are things you cannot buy, and freedom is one of them. Now, as I write this, I know my time is limited. They are getting closer, and I can no longer escape. But maybe you can. Remember, some doors should never be opened. And if they are, it might already be too late. Story 7. My name is Naten, I'm 25 years old, and what I'm about to tell still makes me shudder every time I remember it. I've never been one to believe in supernatural things, but what I've experienced in the last few weeks has completely changed my perception of reality. It's a story I wish I could forget, but I can't. And the more I think about it, the more fear takes root inside me. It all started after I ended an abusive relationship with my ex-fiancée Clara. We had been together for years, and the relationship had become unbearable. Clara was possessive, controlling, and manipulative, and gradually, she destroyed my self-esteem and my peace of mind. When I finally found the strength to end it, I thought the nightmare was over. I was wrong. A few weeks after the breakup, I began to feel a strange presence in my room. At night, just as I was about to fall asleep, it felt as if someone was watching me. At first, I tried to ignore it, attributing it to stress and fatigue. But the feeling only got worse. The room, which was once my sanctuary, became a place of fear. I started to hear strange noises, little creaks, whispers coming from dark corners, soft knocks on the wall, as if someone was trying to get my attention. Initially, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, a result of the trauma from the relationship, but as days passed, the sounds intensified. One night, I suddenly woke up, unable to move. I was lying on my back, eyes open, but my body was completely paralyzed. I knew about sleep paralysis, but I had never experienced it before. Panic took over as I struggled to move, to scream, but I couldn't. My eyes scanned the room, trying to find something that could explain what was happening, and that's when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the room, a tall, hunched figure stood out in the gloom. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, a poorly formed shadow, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was something much more real. The figure had no face, just a mass of darkness where human features should be. Its arms were long and thin, almost skeletal, and extended in an unnatural way. The smell of Clara's cologne filled the room, mixed with a putrid odor, as if something was rotting there. My heart raced, and panic turned into pure terror. The creature began to slowly move towards me, its feet barely touching the ground. I could hear a low growl emanating from somewhere deep inside that thing. As it reached my bed, it slowly climbed on top of me, as if analyzing every involuntary movement my body made. The weight on my chest was overwhelming. I couldn't breathe properly, and each second that passed felt like an eternity. Then, one of its skeletal hands reached out, touching my neck. The cold of the touch was unbearable, as if death itself was holding me. It squeezed my throat, and the sensation was so real I could feel my veins pulsing under its fingers. While I lay there immobile, fear consuming me, the creature began to whisper. It was a language I didn't recognize, but the sound was like poison, corroding my sanity. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. All that escaped was a muffled sigh, as if my body was giving in. Then, out of nowhere, the figure stood up, as if it had finished its terrifying examination, and walked back to the corner of the room, disappearing into the darkness. As soon as it disappeared, I regained control of my body. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding uncontrollably, and ran to turn on the light. The room was empty, but the nauseating smell still lingered in the air. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, trembling, not knowing what to do. When the sun finally began to rise, I decided to investigate what had happened. I started researching sleep paralysis, hoping to find some rational explanation for what I had experienced. I found countless accounts of people who had experienced something similar: shadowy figures, feelings of oppression, incomprehensible whispers. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered on one of the last pages I read. Some accounts spoke of malevolent entities that manifested during episodes of sleep paralysis. These entities, according to some, fed on fear and despair, taking advantage of the vulnerable state of the person stuck in paralysis. In other accounts, people mentioned that these shadowy figures could be linked to traumas or people from the past. That's when real fear set in. I began connecting the dots. The creature I saw, the smell of Clara's cologne mixed with the scent of death. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks. That was something real, something that had been brought into my life, possibly because of the toxic relationship I had with Clara. But why? Why now? The following days were a constant nightmare. Whenever I tried to sleep, the feeling of being watched returned. No matter how much I fought, sleep paralysis dominated me every night, and the creature was always there waiting. It watched me, whispered, and sometimes I could feel its icy touch on my body, leaving marks that were too real to be just dreams. Marks began to appear on other parts of my body. First on my neck, then on my arms and back. They were like scratches, abrasions, as if something was trying to mark me. I knew I needed to get out of that situation, but I didn't know how. I tried to convince myself I was going mad, but the fear was too real to be ignored. On the last night it happened, I woke up with the same paralysis, but this time, the creature was closer, more aggressive. It leaned over me, and for the first time, I felt an overwhelming pressure on my chest. I thought I was going to die there, suffocated by something that shouldn't even exist. But then, something different happened. The creature stopped, as if it was being interrupted, and instead of squeezing tighter, it simply disappeared. The room became cold, but empty. The nauseating smell vanished, and I was able to move again. Since then, I've had no more episodes of sleep paralysis, but the scars, both physical and emotional, are still with me. I keep wondering if the creature has gone away, or if it's just waiting for the right moment to return. I researched more about what could have caused this, and some suggest that the entity might have been linked to my trauma, something that was left behind but not resolved. I don't know what that thing was, but I know I'm not safe. The fear that something like that might return consumes me every day. And the worst part is that I will never know what really happened. I just know that I was marked by something that shouldn't exist, and that somewhere, it might still be waiting for me. If you've ever experienced something similar, you know what I'm talking about. If not, I hope you never need to understand. Some things are better left in the dark, away from eyes and minds. I can only hope that my story serves as a warning. Some doors should never be opened, and some nightmares should never be faced alone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like to support us. And more importantly, if you have a supernatural experience, don't keep it to yourself. Write your story in the comments below. Share your encounter with the inexplicable, feed the collective curiosity, and who knows, maybe together we can unravel these mysteries that linger like fog between the world of the living and the dead. Remember, The unknown is always just a narrative away. And now that night has fallen, who knows what shadows might emerge from the darkness to whisper yet another true horror story.